Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at a figure from the 18th century who is, honestly, a bit of a paradox.
Right, a total paradox.
If you look at the surface, he is a respected historian, a lawyer, a man of the people. But if you dig just a little bit deeper into the biographical records and the history we have, you find a story that is part biography, part heist movie, and part tragedy.
It really is. It's a case study that forces us to ask some uncomfortable questions about how history actually gets preserved. I mean, we tend to think of history as something that belongs in museums, protected by glass and security guards.
Right, completely sterilized.
Exactly. But today we're talking about a time when preserving history was kind of the Wild West.
And the sheriff of this Wild West town was a man named Thomas Martin. Now, in the records, he's almost always referred to by a nickname that, well, once you know his story, it feels really loaded.
Oh, absolutely.
They called him Honest Tom Martin.
Which is just delicious, really, because Honest Tom spent a good portion of his life embroiled in a controversy that was anything but honest.
That is the thread I want to pull on today. We are going to look at how this guy, who branded himself as the ultimate truth teller, built his entire legacy on something that looks suspiciously like theft. We've got the Wikipedia entries, biographical records, and accounts of his massive collection to guide us.
And we should probably clarify right up front, this isn't just about a guy who stole some money or property. It's about a guy who misappropriated the past itself.
So let's set the scene for everyone listening. Who was this guy before he became the controversial Honest Tom? Because his start in life sounds less like a heist movie and more like, I don't know, a sad indie film.
It really does. So Thomas Martin was born on March 8th, 1697 in Thetford. And when I say he's born in Thetford, I mean he was literally born in the schoolhouse of St. Mary's Parish.
Wait, in the actual schoolhouse?
Yeah, his father was the rector there.
Being born in a schoolhouse sounds like you're destined for greatness, or at least, destined to be a massive teacher's pet.
You would think so. But the records specifically say his early education was neglected. And there's this one detail that I think explains almost everything about his personality later in life.
What's that?
For a long stretch of his childhood, Thomas Martin was the only pupil at the Thetford Free School.
Wait, the only student? In the whole school?
Just him.
That is wild.
Right. Imagine that for a second. You are a young boy, bright, curious, and you have absolutely no peers, no playground politics, no distractions, just you in a building full of books and silence.
That does something to a kid's brain. You either become incredibly socially awkward or you develop this intense, singular focus.
Precisely. He didn't have friends, so he had history. He started reading everything he could get his hands on. He became obsessed with the physical history of Thetford, the ruins, the old buildings. He knew the town better than people who had lived there for 50 years.
And that obsession pays off in a huge way when he's just a teenager. I found this part of the story almost hard to believe, but it is in the record. It's 1710, Martin is 13 years old, and a man named Peter Leneve rolls into town.
This is the absolute catalyst for everything.
Yeah.
And we need to pause on Peter Leneve because his title sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. He was the Norroy King of Arms.
Okay, yeah, I saw that in the sources. I assume that doesn't mean he was an actual king with an army.
Not quite, no. In the British heraldic tradition, the kings of arms are the top-ranking officers. They are the ones who grant coats of arms, trace genealogies, and verify who is actually nobility and who is just faking it.
Wow, okay.
It is a position of immense prestige and power. Leneve was also the first president of the revived Society of Antiquaries.
So he is basically the genealogy gatekeeper. He is a rock star in the history world.
A total rock star. And he comes to Thetford looking for information. He wants someone to show him the local antiquities. And the townspeople, adults mind you, tell him, we don't really know, but there is this kid, Master Martin. He knows everything.
That is such a cinematic moment. The high society scholar from London being led around the ruins by a 13-year-old boy.
And Leneve was totally charmed by him. He realized this wasn't just a smart kid. This was a prodigy. That meeting sparked a lifelong friendship and mentorship that lasted for nearly 2 decades, right up until Leneve's death in 1729.
Wow.
Leneve basically adopted him into the world of antiquarianism.
Can we define that term, actually?
Yeah.
Antiquarian, we use it a lot, and I think today people just hear historian and think it's the same thing.
Right.
But in the 1700s, it meant something slightly different, right?
It did. A historian writes narratives about the past. An antiquarian is obsessed with the physical remnants of the past. Documents, coins, seals, ruins.
It's much more tangible.
Exactly. It's about collecting the raw data of history. And often, antiquarians were seen as a bit eccentric. They were the hoarders of history.
Got it. So they aren't necessarily writing the textbook. They're the ones saving the scraps of paper the textbook is based on.
Precisely. And Martin wanted to be part of that world desperately. He wanted to go to Cambridge University, but, and here's the barrier, he couldn't afford it.
Which is tragic. The boy genius hits the financial paywall.
It's a very common story, sadly. So instead of becoming a professor, he had to get a job. He became a clerk for his brother, Robert, and eventually he became a lawyer. But the sources are very clear on this. He disliked it immensely.
He felt trapped by the day job.
He felt like he was wasting his time on legal paperwork when he should have been studying ancient manuscripts. But ironically, becoming a lawyer gave him the exact tools he would later use to manipulate the system.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. He is a reluctant lawyer. He is settled in a town called Palgrave in Suffolk, and he's starting to build his reputation. This is where Honest Tom comes into play. We mentioned earlier that the nickname becomes ironic, but where did it actually come from? Was it sarcastic from the start?
No, initially it was completely genuine. It referred to his personality. We have a description from a contemporary of his named Cole that paints a very vivid picture. He calls Martin a blunt, rough, honest, downright man.
So he wasn't a polite society gentleman.
Far from it. He didn't have the polished manners of the London elite. He was loud, he was opinionated, and his diet, well, that is legendary.
Oh, I have to read this quote from the notes because I absolutely love it. Cole says that while other people were having tea or coffee for breakfast, Martin would have get this beefsteak or other strong meat and strong beer.
For breakfast.
It is such a power move. I don't need caffeine. I need a porterhouse and a pint of ale.
It tells you everything about his brand. He was earthy, he was authentic, he was honest Tom because he didn't pretend to be refined. He wanted people to know him as this rough-hewn guardian of truth.
And he had the visual to match that reputation. He lived in a very large house in Palgrave, which sadly was pulled down in 1860, but it had 13 windows facing the village church. He was a massive local fixture.
He was. And his status was growing, too. He joined the Spalding Gentlemen's Society. He became a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in 1720.
He's moving up in the world.
Definitely. He eventually became their senior fellow. They even referred to his hoary hairs as a crown of glory at their anniversaries. People really respected him.
They really did. He was the old guard. But here is where the tension starts to build. Because underneath this honest, beer-drinking exterior, there was a real hunger. Cole mentions that Martin's thirst after antiquities was as great as his thirst after liquors.
He was an addict.
He was. He needed to possess the past. And that need led him to the defining moment of his life. The moment where Honest Tom does something incredibly questionable.
And this involves his mentor, right? The rock star Peter Lenève.
Yes. So Peter Lenève dies in 1729. Now remember, Lenève had spent his entire life collecting documents. He had a massive, invaluable archive of English history. And in his will, he had a very specific plan for it. He wanted it to go to a public institution.
Which makes total sense. He is the king of arms. He wants this stuff preserved for the nation.
Right. And he appointed 2 executors to make sure that happened. One was a man named Thomas Tanner. The other was his old protege, Thomas Martin.
Okay, so Martin is legally responsible for making sure these items go to the public.
That was the job. But then life happens. The other executor, Tanner, moves away to become a bishop. So Martin is left in sole charge of the estate. And around the exact same time, Martin's own wife, Sarah, tragically dies in 1731, just days after giving birth to twins.
Wow. So he's grieving, he's alone, and he is sitting on this mountain of history that belongs to his dead mentor.
And then comes the plot twist. A very short time later, Thomas Martin marries again. And who does he marry? Frances.
Wait, Frances Lenève?
Frances Lenève, the mentor's widow.
You're kidding.
I am not. He marries the widow.
That feels incredibly convenient.
It was incredibly convenient.
Okay.
Because under the laws of the time, by marrying the widow, Martin basically gained control over the household goods. He effectively merged Lenève's estate with his own.
So he just bypassed the will entirely.
He completely ignored the public institution part. He took the collection that was meant for the public and just kept it. He moved it all into his big house with the 13 windows in Palgrave.
Wow. So Honest Tom essentially embezzled a museum.
In modern terms, yes, absolutely. Later historians were furious about this. Richard Gough, for instance, wrote that Martin illegally came into the possession of the collection. He actually called it the greatest fund of antiquities for his native county that ever was collected for any single one in the kingdom.
The greatest fund of antiquities. And Martin just absorbed it into his living room.
Exactly. I'm trying to get into his head here. Do you think he did it for the money? Was he planning to sell it off and get rich?
I don't think so. Not at first. That is the really complex part of this case study. It wasn't financial greed, it was intellectual greed. He just couldn't bear to let the collection go. He felt, probably quite arrogantly, that he was the only one who truly understood it. He wanted to be the keeper of the flame, even if he had to steal the candle to do it.
Yeah, it is the darker side of being a collector. It is that Gollum mentality, my precious.
It really is. And he didn't stop there. He kept adding to the hoard. In 1753, he acquired another massive collection from a man named Francis Bloomfield. And this acquisition is really important because it contained the Paston Letters.
I saw that name heavily featured in the notes. The Paston Letters. Why are those such a big deal? Is it just because they're old?
Oh no, it is much more than that. The Paston Letters are arguably the most important collection of private correspondence from the 15th century in England.
Really? Why?
Because usually, history is written by kings and monks. It is all official decrees and chronicles of battles. The Paston Letters are letters between family members, a wealthy Norfolk family during the Wars of the Roses. They talk about lawsuits, shopping, marriage problems, and, things like, hey, don't come home today because there's a literal battle happening down the road.
So it is basically the Twitter feed of the 1400s.
Yes. It gives us the texture of daily life in a way nothing else does. Without the Paston Letters, the 15th century goes completely dark on a human level.
Yeah.
And Honest Tom had them sitting in his house, possibly right next to his breakfast steak and beer.
That is terrifying to think about. If his house burns down, we lose the texture of the 15th century.
That is exactly the stakes we are talking about. He had concentrated a dangerous amount of history in one wooden house in Suffolk.
But he did study them, right? He wasn't just hoarding them like old newspapers in the attic.
To his credit, yes, he was a very diligent scholar. He annotated them, he organized them, he knew exactly what he had. In his mind, he was probably curating the collection better than any public library would have.
Right. I'm not stealing it, I'm protecting it.
That is the likely rationalization. But the problem with hoarding history is that eventually you die. And you can't take the collection with you.
And this is where the tragedy really sets in. Because Martin's later years weren't exactly golden, were they?
No, they were not. And there is a sad irony here. Martin was a lawyer, a man who should have been good with money and contracts. But his obsession with the past completely destroyed his present. He spent so much time on his antiquarian hobbies that his legal practice collapsed.
He went broke.
He was destitute. He had severe money troubles, and this is the ultimate nightmare for any collector. To pay his debts, he had to start selling off the hoard.
Oh, that hurts. Selling the very thing you stole to protect.
Piece by piece. He was selling off precious manuscripts just to keep the lights on. It must have been agonizing for him. It was a slow-motion collapse of his life's work.
And when he finally died, this was in 1771, right? Just one day before his 71st birthday.
Yes. And he was buried in the porch of the Palgrave Parish Church.
What was left of the collection at that point?
A lot was still left, but there was no plan. Because he had illegally taken the collection, there was no legal framework to protect it. He hadn't set up a trust, he hadn't contacted a museum. So when he died, it basically turned into a giant garage sale.
A literal garage sale.
Practically. A man named John Worth bought the bulk of the remaining collection for £600.
£600. Who was John Worth? Was he another historian or a scholar?
No, he was a chemist, a local businessman. He saw it purely as inventory.
That is heartbreaking.
Wolfe didn't care about the history at all. He just cared about the return on investment. So he immediately started chopping it up to flip it. He sold the printed books to a firm called Booth and Barry in Norwich. He sent the precious manuscripts down to London to be sold. He auctioned off the pictures and the lesser curiosities at a sale in Dis.
So the very thing Lenev was afraid of, the scattering of his life's work, happened precisely because Martin tried to prevent it.
It is the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. By holding onto it too tight, he crushed it. The collection was fractured forever. The Paston Letters survived, thankfully, but they went one way. The notes on Thetford went another.
It sounds like a complete disaster for English history. But did anything good come out of this chaos?
Well, this is where we have to look at the nuance of the situation. Yes, it was a disaster in terms of keeping the archives intact. But because the stuff was sold on the open market, it ended up in the hands of people who actually could and did publish it.
Like who?
Well, remember, Richard Gough, the historian who was so mad at Martin for stealing the collection,
Right.
Gough ended up buying a lot of the Thetford material from the sales, and in 1779, he published the history of the town of Thetford,
And that was based on Martin's notes.
almost entirely based on Martin's notes. Martin had done the hard work, he just couldn't bring himself to finish it and let it go. Gough got it across the finish line posthumously.
So Martin gets the credit, but only after he is gone.
Exactly. And the rest of his notes ended up with collectors like Sir John Cullum and John Ives. Eventually, a lot of those fragments trickled into museums or private libraries, like the Suffolk Institute of Archaeology. Even today, you can find books and papers with Thomas Martin's distinct handwriting in the margins. His notes are literally written on the history of England.
I want to go back to something you touched on earlier. You said his misappropriation might have actually saved some of this stuff. How do you figure that if he hadn't stolen it, it would have gone to a museum, right?
Ideally, yes. But let's look at the reality of 1730s institutions. They weren't exactly climate-controlled vaults with digital backups. Public libraries had fires, they had damp basements, they suffered from severe neglect. Things got lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy all the time.
So you are saying a public institution might have just let stuff rot away.
It is entirely possible by taking it home, by being obsessively, jealously in love with these objects. Martin ensured they were looked at, handled, and cared for during a very vulnerable period in history.
That is a really provocative thought for everyone listening to chew on. Is a jealous, selfish owner sometimes a better guardian than a cold, indifferent institution?
That is the Honest Tom paradox in a nutshell. His methods were unethical, he broke the law, he betrayed his mentor's trust. But we still have the Paston Letters, we still know the intimate history of Thetford. The result, in a weird way, almost justifies the obsession.
It really blurs the line between a hoarder and a curator.
It does, and it forces us to reconsider that nickname, Honest Tom.
Yeah, let's circle back to that as we wrap up. Do we think he died thinking he was an honest man?
I genuinely think he did. I think in his mind he was true to the history, he was honest about what mattered, which is the preservation of the past, even if he had to be dishonest about the laws of the present to achieve it.
He was honest to the objects, not to the people.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
So, what is the ultimate takeaway here for us? Aside from, don't marry your mentor's widow to steal their books.
I think it's about recognizing that history is not a clean process. We look at an artifact in a museum, and we assume it got there through a logical, legal, pristine process. But often, that object survived because some eccentric weirdo in the 18th century decided to hoard it in his attic and drink strong beer while reading it.
We owe a lot to the weirdos.
We really do. Without the obsession of people like Thomas Martin, flawed, rough, dishonest people, our understanding of the past would be full of massive holes.
Well, that is a fascinating place to leave it. Thomas Martin of Palgrave.
Yeah.
A thief, a genius, a drunk, and a savior of history.
A very complicated man for a very complicated job.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, the next time you are in a museum looking at a pristine manuscript under glass, just remember it might have gotten there thanks to a guy like Honest Tom. And maybe think of him next time you have a beer for breakfast. Thanks for diving in with us today.
A pleasure as always.
We will see you on the next deep dive. Stay curious.